For decades, Prince Philip's financial legacy remained one of the monarchy's most closely guarded secrets, hidden behind sealed ledgers, private trusts, and confidential legal walls. But everything changed the moment royal accountants quietly confirmed something no one was ever supposed to know. Funds from Philip's private trust, millions in silent transfers, had been directed not to his eldest son, King Charles, but to his youngest, Prince Edward. And that revelation didn't just raise questions, it ignited a storm. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. The discovery did not begin with suspicion, it began with routine. Following Prince Philip's passing, royal estate transition protocols required a full reconciliation of dormant financial structures accounts that had remained untouched, frozen in legal silence until the moment his death activated the machinery of inheritance review. Senior accountants, individuals who had spent decades navigating the monarchy's most sensitive financial ecosystems, approached the task with clinical precision. Their mission was simple: verify balances, confirm beneficiaries, and ensure continuity. But what they encountered was anything but simple. It was structured, intentional, and quietly explosive. At first, the transfers appeared unremarkable scheduled distributions from a private trust, executed in compliance with legal authority. But as the accountants traced the timeline backward, a pattern began to emerge. These were not isolated payments triggered by Philip's death. They were staggered movements of wealth, executed years earlier, carefully spaced, deliberately timed. And at the center of every transfer, one name appeared again and again: Prince Edward. Not Charles. Never Charles. The omission was not accidental, it was consistent. And consistency, in financial architecture of this magnitude, is never coincidence. It is design. The room shifted as realization took hold. What they were looking at was not inheritance in the traditional sense. It was strategy. Philip had begun transferring portions of his private trust long before his final days, exercising personal authority over wealth that existed outside the rigid boundaries of crown-controlled assets. These were his decisions, made in silence, beyond ceremonial obligation, beyond expectation. And with each confirmed transaction, the implication grew heavier. Philip had not simply distributed his legacy equally, he had chosen. At first, some officials searched for procedural explanations: clerical error, misfiled authorization, administrative oversight. But the documentation was flawless. Every transfer bore Philip's direct authorization. Every signature aligned. Every legal safeguard had been satisfied. This was not a mistake buried in paperwork. This was intention preserved in ink. And intention, once proven, cannot be undone. Emotional shock moved quietly through palace corridors. No announcement was made, but those closest to the financial nerve center of the monarchy understood what this meant. The heir to the throne, King Charles, had not been the recipient of Philip's private trust distributions. The future sovereign, the man destined to carry the crown's full weight, had been bypassed in the most personal financial decision Philip ever made. And in his place stood Edward, the youngest son, long perceived as peripheral, now revealed as central to a secret legacy no one had anticipated. Whispers began carefully, cautiously. Senior aides spoke in lowered voices behind secured doors, their words heavy with uncertainty, questions formed without answers. Why Edward? Why now? And perhaps most unsettling of all, what had Philip seen, understood, or decided that led him to make this irreversible choice? Because financial transfers of this magnitude are never emotional impulses. They are conclusions, final judgments rendered not in anger, but in clarity. And as those whispers spread, they carried with them something far more dangerous than curiosity. They carried doubt. Doubt about assumptions long believed unshakable. Doubt about relationships that had appeared stable. Doubt about the invisible structure of loyalty within the royal family itself. For decades, the monarchy had projected unity, continuity, certainty. But hidden beneath that certainty, Philip had been building something else, something quiet, something no one was supposed to discover until it was too late to question. Because money, within the monarchy, has never been just money. It is trust, it is influence, it is belief made tangible. And when Philip directed his private trust away from Charles and toward Edward, he wasn't merely redistributing wealth, he was redistributing something far more profound: confidence. And confidence, once transferred, carries consequences that ripple far beyond numbers on a ledger. It reshapes relationships. It redraws emotional boundaries. It forces those left behind to confront truths they never expected to face. Behind the composed faces and controlled public appearances, the reality was already settling into place. Philip had made his decision long ago. He had executed it patiently, methodically, ensuring its permanence. And now, with his absence sealing its finality, there was nothing anyone could do to reverse it. The accountants had confirmed it. The documents had proven it. The silence surrounding it only made it heavier. But as investigators dug deeper into the financial structure itself, they discovered something even more disturbing. The transfers were not accidental anomalies, but RT of a deliberate system Philip had constructed long before anyone realized what he was planning. Prince Philip was never a man who left things to chance. Behind his blunt exterior was a mind obsessed with structure, control, and legacy. And hidden deep within his financial empire was a private trust so carefully engineered that even senior royal advisors barely understood its true purpose. But when accountants finally gained access, they uncovered a chilling truth. This trust wasn't just protecting Philip's legacy, it was actively reshaping the monarchy's future. What the accountants had uncovered in the previous phase was only the surface, a trail of transfers, undeniable yet incomplete. But now, as they pushed deeper into the legal foundation itself, the architecture of Philip's private trust began to reveal its true nature. This was not something created in haste or emotional reaction. It had been built decades earlier, quietly, deliberately, and with extraordinary precision. At a time when the monarchy itself was evolving under pressure, Philip had constructed a financial mechanism entirely separate from crown authority, shielded from ceremonial expectations, and immune to institutional interference. It existed in a space that belonged to him alone. Unlike the crown estate or sovereign inheritance, which followed rigid protocols shaped by centuries of tradition, this trust answered to no one but Philip. It was his personal instrument of control. He determined its beneficiaries, he defined its conditions, and perhaps most importantly, he controlled its secrecy. Even those closest to him, legal advisors, family members, senior palace officials, were only permitted partial visibility. No single individual, aside from Philip himself, ever held the full picture. That was not an accident. It was protection, not of wealth, but of intention. As the accountants reviewed the layered documentation, the complexity became undeniable. Multiple legal shells, independent trustees bound by confidentiality agreements that extended beyond Philip's lifetime, carefully staggered release mechanisms that activated not all at once, but gradually, year after year, decision after decision. And within those release mechanisms, Edward's name appeared not as an afterthought, but as a central pillar. This was not an inheritance waiting to be distributed. This was a pipeline already flowing. Philip had not waited for death to transfer his confidence. He had acted while alive, while fully aware, while fully in control. And what Edward received was far more than monetary support. The trust held diversified assets, liquid reserves, yes, but also quiet, controlling interests in private ventures whose influence extended beyond balance sheets. These were levers of long-term power. With each transfer, Edward's financial independence strengthened, but so did his autonomy within the royal structure. He was no longer simply a supporting figure in the monarchy's hierarchy. He was becoming something else, something Philip had clearly envisioned. Most chilling of all were the final amendments, signed in Philip's later years when time itself had become fragile. These modifications did not weaken Edward's position. They reinforced it. The language was firm, protective, intentional. Philip had ensured the trust would continue functioning exactly as he designed it, without interruption, without interference, without reinterpretation. Legal safeguards blocked automatic disclosure, No ceremonial obligation required Charles to be informed. No crown authority could override its terms. This trust existed beyond the monarchy's visible chain of command, operating in the quiet space between family loyalty and personal judgment. And in that quiet space, Philip had spoken louder than any public declaration ever could, not through words, not through ceremony, but through permanence. Because financial structures like this do not emerge from momentary emotion. They emerge from long observation, from conclusions drawn over years of watching, weighing, and deciding. Every clause, every signature, every carefully timed transfer reflected a conclusion Philip had reached, a conclusion about trust, about reliability, about who he believed would carry forward something only he fully understood. The realization settled heavily over those now examining the trust's origins. This was not merely a redistribution of wealth, it was a reflection of belief. Philip had designed a system that ensured Edward would stand financially empowered long after his absence, protected not by tradition, but by his personal will. And in doing so, he had created something irreversible, something Charles, despite his position as king, could neither control nor undo. Because this trust had never been subject to royal expectation, it had been subject only to Philip's judgment, and judgment, once sealed in legal certainty, becomes history. And as the timeline of those amendments came into focus, it became impossible to ignore one devastating question: what had changed between Philip and Charles that led to this irreversible decision? To the world, Prince Philip and Charles were bound by duty, blood, and destiny. But behind palace walls, their relationship was far more complicated, marked by disagreement, disappointment, and emotional distance that neither man ever publicly addressed. Now, as the trust transfers came to light, insiders began to revisit moments long buried in royal history, moments that suddenly looked less like misunderstandings and more like the early signs of a decision Philip had already made. What had once been dismissed as ordinary generational differences now felt heavier, more deliberate. The trust was no longer just a financial mechanism. It was evidence of something deeply personal, something rooted not in recent events, but in decades of quiet observation. Philip had spent a lifetime studying his eldest son, watching him not only as a father, but as a man who understood the unforgiving weight of monarchy. And over time, subtle doubts had taken shape, doubts Philip never voiced publicly, but perhaps never truly released. Charles had always been different from Philip. Where Philip projected steel, Charles carried sensitivity. Where Philip thrived on emotional restraint, Charles embraced reflection and expression. These differences, while invisible to the public eye, shaped their private dynamic in ways that could never be undone. Philip believed monarchy demanded endurance above all else, endurance without hesitation, endurance without emotional exposure. And while Charles possessed strength in his own way, Philip often questioned whether that strength aligned with the kind he believed the crown required. Their disagreements were rarely explosive, but they were persistent. They emerged in conversations about the monarchy's future, its role in a changing world, its need or lack thereof for adaptation. Charles saw evolution as survival. Philip saw preservation as protection. Neither man was entirely wrong, but their visions were fundamentally incompatible. And incompatibility, when left unresolved, quietly transforms into distance. Over time, that distance hardened not into hostility, but into quiet emotional separation. What made this separation even more painful was its invisibility. In public, Philip and Charles fulfilled their roles flawlessly. They stood together. They appeared united. They honored tradition side by side. But beneath that unity, something unspoken lingered. Philip had begun to see Charles not simply as his son, but as a man whose instincts he did not fully share. And for Philip, instinct was everything. It was the invisible compass that guided judgment, loyalty, and trust. Meanwhile, Edward's presence in Philip's life remained steady, unchallenging, quietly dependable. Edward did not seek to reshape the monarchy. He did not question its foundations. He moved within its boundaries with calm acceptance, reinforcing Philip's belief in continuity over change. Where Charles represented uncertainty, Edward represented stability. And for a man like Philip, who had witnessed global upheaval, political transformation, and personal sacrifice, stability was not comfort, it was survival. The trust transfers, now exposed, felt less like sudden decisions and more like the final stage of a long internal conclusion. Philip had not acted impulsively. He had acted consistently with beliefs he had formed over decades. Each transfer was not merely a financial act, it was a reflection of confidence. Confidence in Edward's discretion, confidence in Edward's loyalty, confidence in Edward's alignment with Philip's understanding of monarchy itself. And perhaps, in the quietest and most painful way possible, it reflected Philip's uncertainty about Charles. Those within the palace who began connecting these emotional threads could not ignore the implications. This was not about favoritism in the traditional sense. It was about something deeper, something structural. Philip had not challenged Charles publicly, had not humiliated him, had not interfered with his path to the throne. But privately, through his trust, he had shifted something invisible, yet powerful. He had ensured Edward would carry not just wealth, but independence, influence, security beyond crown dependency. And that decision, made in silence, spoke volumes, because Philip understood something few others fully grasped. The crown itself was symbolic power, but financial autonomy, the ability to stand beyond institutional reliance, was personal power. And by granting that autonomy to Edward, Philip had quietly altered the internal balance of strength within the royal family. He had created a second centre of quiet authority, one that existed parallel to the throne itself. For Charles, the consequences were not material, they were emotional. The realization that his father had entrusted Edward with something so permanent, so intentional, could not be measured in currency. It could only be felt in absence of inclusion, absence of affirmation, absence of something Charles may never have realized he needed until he discovered it had been given to someone else. Yet to understand why Edward emerged as the chosen recipient, investigators had to examine his unique position within the royal family, a role that, until now, had been quietly underestimated. For much of his life, Prince Edward stood in the shadows, overshadowed by his elder brothers, and rarely seen as a central figure in royal power. But beneath that quiet exterior, Edward had built something far more valuable, his father's unwavering trust. And as accountants confirmed Philip's financial choices, it became clear that Edward's role in the monarchy was never as minor as the public believed. Edward's rise was never loud, it never demanded attention. It unfolded quietly, patiently, in moments most people overlooked. While public fascination often gravitated toward Charles as the heir and William as the future, Edward existed in a different space, closer to Philip, closer to the private world where expectations were not performed, but lived. This proximity was not accidental. It was earned over years of consistency, loyalty, and emotional steadiness that Philip came to rely on more than anyone realized. As Philip entered the later chapters of his life, withdrawing from public appearances and formal obligations, his world grew smaller. And in that smaller world, Edward was present. Not as a replacement, not as a rival, but as a constant. He listened when others spoke. He stayed when others left. He understood when words were unnecessary. Philip, a man who valued strength not in noise but in endurance, recognized something familiar. In Edward, a quiet resilience that did not seek validation. And in the monarchy, where ambition often speaks louder than loyalty, that restraint carried enormous weight. Edward never attempted to reshape Philip's thinking. He did not challenge his authority. He did not question his judgment. Instead, he reinforced it. He supported Philip's initiatives, stood beside him during his most private reflections, and honored the invisible boundaries Philip placed between public duty and personal belief. This created something rare between them: mutual trust without friction. Philip did not need Edward to prove himself. Edward had already done so simply by being present, by being dependable when it mattered most. Over time, their relationship evolved beyond father and son. Edward became a confidant, not through grand gestures, but through quiet understanding. Philip, who had spent his entire life carrying the burden of expectation, found in Edward a kind of emotional clarity he could not always find elsewhere. There was no tension, no ideological divide, only alignment. And alignment, in Philip's world, was everything. This emotional closeness slowly translated into something more tangible, something measurable. The trust transfers were not sudden acts of generosity. They were the final expression of a belief Philip had nurtured over years. Each transfer represented more than financial support, it represented validation. It represented Philip's decision to equip Edward with independence, to ensure he would never stand vulnerable to institutional limitation or external influence. Edward was not simply receiving wealth, he was receiving autonomy. With financial independence secured through Philip's private trust, Edward's position within the royal family transformed in ways few could immediately see. He was no longer defined solely by his place in the line of succession. He existed beyond it, protected by a foundation Philip himself had built. This was not ceremonial elevation, it was strategic empowerment. Philip had ensured Edward would carry forward something permanent, something shielded from political shifts, public pressure, and institutional control. What made this decision even more profound was its intentional silence. Philip had never announced it, never explained it. He had allowed Edward's rise to remain invisible, concealed beneath layers of legal confidentiality and emotional discretion. But now, with the trust exposed, its meaning became impossible to ignore. Philip had not simply trusted Edward with money, he had trusted him with continuity, with stability, with the quiet preservation of something Philip believed might otherwise be lost. For Edward, this was not triumph in the traditional sense. It was responsibility. It was the weight of knowing his father had seen in him something uniquely reliable, something worthy of protection and investment. And while the public might never fully understand the depth of that trust, Edward would carry its significance for the rest of his life. But as Edward's financial empowerment became undeniable, attention shifted to Charles and how the future king would react to a decision that effectively bypassed him entirely. No announcement was made. No statement was issued. But behind palace doors, the revelation hit Charles like an emotional earthquake. The trust fund transfers weren't just financial, they were deeply personal. They suggested something far more painful than lost wealth, a loss of confidence. And as Charles confronted the truth in private, those closest to him began to notice something unusual. He wasn't angry. He was quiet. The moment itself was controlled, procedural, almost cold in its delivery. Royal financial briefings had always been handled with formality, shielded from emotion by layers of protocol. But this briefing was different. The accountants presented the facts with careful neutrality, outlining the structure, the transfers, the legal finality. They did not speculate. They did not interpret. They simply confirmed what the documents already declared. Philip's private trust had empowered Edward, and Charles, despite being the heir, had not been included in the same way. Charles listened without interruption. He asked no immediate questions. He did not demand clarification. He did not challenge the findings. Those present would later recall that his composure remained intact, his posture steady, his voice calm. But beneath that calm, something far more complex was unfolding. Because this was not merely information, it was revelation. And revelation, when it comes from someone no longer alive to explain it, carries a unique kind of finality. For Charles, this was not about financial dependence. He did not need the trust. He had never relied on it, but the meaning behind it could not be dismissed. Philip had made a choice, a conscious, deliberate choice to place his private confidence elsewhere. And confidence, especially between father and son, cannot be measured in currency. It is measured in belief, in affirmation, in the silent assurance that one has been seen, understood, and trusted. The absence of that assurance lingered in ways no public acknowledgement ever could. Those closest to Charles began to notice subtle changes, not dramatic shifts, not outward displays of hurt, but quieter signs, longer pauses, Fewer personal reflections, a deeper inward focus that suggested something was being processed beneath the surface. Charles had spent his entire life preparing to inherit a crown. But this was different. This was not inheritance. This was judgment. A judgment Philip had delivered privately, permanently, and without explanation. Advisors, aware of the emotional sensitivity surrounding the discovery, approached cautiously. Some feared the trust transfers could fracture internal unity if mishandled. Others worried about the psychological burden placed on Charles, a burden made heavier by the fact that he could never confront Philip directly. There would be no conversation, no reconciliation, no opportunity to ask why. The decision existed in silence, immune to interpretation, resistant to closure. Yet Charles did not retaliate. He did not attempt to challenge the trust's legal authority, despite possessing the institutional power to scrutinize nearly every aspect of royal financial administration. He respected its boundaries, or perhaps he understood something deeper, that challenging it would not change its meaning. The trust was not simply a financial arrangement. It was a reflection of Philip's final emotional conclusions. And those conclusions, once expressed, could not be rewritten. His silence became its own form of response, not acceptance, not rejection, but endurance. Charles had learned from Philip, after all, that strength often revealed itself not in confrontation, but in restraint. Still, restraint did not erase the emotional impact. It did not erase the realization that Edward now carried a form of autonomy Philip had personally ensured. And it did not erase the question that lingered, unspoken yet unavoidable. What had Philip seen in Edward that he had not seen in him? The weight of that question did not fade. It remained present, woven into Charles's private reflections, shaping thoughts he would never publicly share. Because monarchy demands composure above all else. It demands silence even in moments of personal uncertainty. And Charles, bound by that expectation, carried forward without revealing the emotional cost of what he had learned. Yet as Charles struggled privately, the palace itself faced an even greater threat, the potential exposure of Philip's intentions to the public. The monarchy thrives on stability, but stability depends on secrecy. And now, that secrecy was slipping. Palace officials realized that if Philip's financial decisions became public, the narrative of royal unity could fracture overnight. Quiet meetings were held, legal teams mobilized, and a silent race began not to reverse Philip's decision, but to control its consequences. What had once existed safely within confidential records was now circulating among a small but growing circle of insiders. Each new individual brought into awareness increased the risk of exposure. And exposure, within an institution built on controlled perception, represented a threat far more dangerous than the decision itself. Because the monarchy did not simply rely on authority, it relied on belief in continuity, belief in harmony, belief that the family stood united, even when private realities were far more complicated. Senior palace advisors understood immediately that Philip's trust transfers carried implications beyond finance. They revealed intention. And intention, once questioned publicly, could invite scrutiny not only into Philip's judgment, but into the internal dynamics of the royal family itself. Questions would arise. Questions about Charles, questions about Edward, questions about trust, loyalty, and why one son had been quietly empowered while the other carried the visible burden of the crown. These were not questions the monarchy could afford to answer. Containment became the priority. Information flow was restricted. Discussions were limited to those whose roles required direct involvement. Legal teams reviewed every clause of the trust, searching not for ways to reverse it, because reversal was impossible, but for ways to prevent forced disclosure. The structure Philip had built was legally impenetrable. He had anticipated interference, he had anticipated scrutiny, and he had ensured neither would alter his final design. That realization sent an unmistakable signal through palace leadership. This was not a situation that could be fixed. It could only be managed. Privately, advisors debated strategy. Some argued that silence would preserve stability. Others feared silence itself carried risk, that secrets have a way of surfacing when least expected. The modern monarchy existed in an era where confidentiality was fragile, where internal revelations could escape into public consciousness without warning. The trust's existence, if revealed without preparation, could reshape public perception overnight. It could create narratives of division, of favoritism, of emotional fracture within the very institution meant to symbolize unity. Meanwhile, Edward's position had quietly transformed. No formal announcement marked the shift, but those within the palace understood its significance. He now possessed a form of independence few royals ever achieved. Financial autonomy insulated him from institutional reliance. It gave him freedom. And freedom, within a rigid hierarchy, alters relationships in ways that cannot be reversed. Edward was no longer simply a participant in the monarchy. He was something more complex, someone carrying a legacy Philip had personally secured. This subtle shift did not go unnoticed. Advisors began recalibrating the understanding of internal balance. Charles remained king. His authority was unquestioned, but Edward now existed beyond traditional dependency. That reality created quiet tension, not confrontation, not rivalry, but uncertainty. Because uncertainty weakens predictability. And predictability is the foundation upon which monarchy survives. Institutional loyalty was tested in silence. Those aware of the trust's existence carried knowledge that could not be shared freely. They understood its emotional weight, its symbolic meaning, and its potential consequences. Yet they also understood their responsibility to protect the institution above individual interpretation. The monarchy had survived centuries of crisis by controlling narrative, by preserving composure, even when reality was far more fragile than appearance suggested. Still, beneath that composure, the truth remained. Philip's decision had introduced something irreversible into the monarchy's internal structure. It had reshaped influence, it had reshaped perception, and most importantly, it had reshaped understanding. Those closest to the truth could feel it. The monarchy was no longer exactly as it had been before the discovery. Something fundamental had shifted, not publicly, not visibly, but undeniably. Because Philip had not simply distributed wealth, he had communicated belief, and belief, once expressed through irreversible action, carries meaning no institution can fully contain. But as the dust settled, one truth became impossible to ignore. Philip's decision wasn't just financial. It was a final message. Prince Philip was never a man of dramatic speeches. He expressed himself through action, and now, in death, his most powerful statement had emerged not through words, but through financial certainty. The trust transfers revealed something deeply personal. Philip had chosen Edward not just as a beneficiary, but as a guardian of something far greater. For those who had spent years trying to understand Philip, not the public figure, but the private man, this revelation reframed everything. His silence had never been emptiness. It had been calculation. Every decision he made carried meaning, even when that meaning was invisible at the time. And now, through the quiet authority of his private trust, Philip had spoken in the only language he truly trusted: permanence. This was not an emotional gesture made in the fragility of his final days. It was the culmination of decades spent observing, evaluating, and ultimately deciding who would carry forward his personal legacy. Edward's role in that legacy was not symbolic, it was functional. By securing Edward's independence, Philip ensured that his youngest son would stand beyond the reach of institutional limitations. Edward would not need to seek approval. He would not need to rely on ceremonial allocation or political negotiation. He would exist within the monarchy, but not entirely bound by it. This distinction mattered deeply to Philip. He had lived long enough to understand how institutions could shape, restrict, and sometimes weaken individuals. Through the trust, he gave Edward something rare: freedom within structure. This act redefined relationships in ways no public declaration ever could. Charles remained king. His authority was absolute within the framework of the crown. But Philip's trust had created a parallel line of influence, quieter, less visible, but no less significant. Edward now carried something uniquely his father's: not the crown, not the throne, but the private confidence of a man who had spent his life protecting the monarchy from within. And that confidence, once transferred, became its own form of inheritance. More than anything, the trust reflected alignment. Philip had not chosen Edward out of obligatio, or convenience. He had chosen him because he believed Edward understood something essential, something unspoken about loyalty, endurance, and the responsibility of preservation. Philip had always valued stability above popularity, strength above recognition. In Edward, he saw continuity, someone who would not disrupt what Philip had spent a lifetime defending, someone who would protect, not reshape. For Edward, this inheritance carried emotional weight far beyond financial value. It was affirmation. It was responsibility. It was proof that Philip's faith in him had been deliberate and unwavering. And with that faith came expectation. Edward was no longer simply Philip's son. He was the steward of something invisible yet powerful, a continuation of Philip's private will, preserved not through ceremony, but through certainty. Within the monarchy, the effects of this decision began to ripple quietly. No official hierarchy had changed, no titles had shifted, yet the emotional architecture of the royal family had subtly transformed. Trust, once assumed to flow in predictable directions, had revealed itself to be far more personal, far more selective. Those who understood the trust's meaning recognized its permanence. Philip's influence had not ended with his passing. It had been secured, preserved, and placed deliberately into Edward's hands. And perhaps that was Philip's final act of control. Not control over the crown, but control over his own legacy. He had ensured that something deeply personal would endure beyond his lifetime, protected from reinterpretation, immune to institutional revision. His voice, never loud in life, had become unmistakable in absence, not through explanation, but through action that required no explanation at all. And yet, the consequences of that decision were only beginning to unfold. Prince Philip's decision did not rewrite the line of Sucy, SS, but it rewrote something just as powerful, the balance of trust. As Edward stepped forward, carrying his father's private legacy, and Charles carried the crown itself, a silent divide lingered between them. And within that divide remained one haunting truth: the monarchy's greatest battles were never fought in public, but in private. What Philip had done could not be reversed. The transfers were complete. The authority had shifted, and while the world outside remained unaware, inside the monarchy, the emotional consequences had already taken hold. Edward now possessed something permanent: financial independence, forged not through ceremonial inheritance, but through personal selection. This independence did not challenge Charles's crown, but it altered something more subtle and more dangerous. It altered perception. It altered emotional gravity. It altered the quiet understanding of who Philip had trusted most when it mattered most. Edward never spoke publicly about the trust. He never acknowledged its deeper meaning, but he didn't need to. His silence reflected the same discipline Philip had lived by. He understood that what he carried was not meant for display. It was meant for preservation. And with that preservation came influence, not loud, not confrontational, but present. Advisors now looked at Edward differently, not because his title had changed, but because his foundation had. He stood on something stronger than institutional allocation. He stood on his father's final belief. Meanwhile, Charles continued forward, fulfilling his role as king with unwavering composure. His public duties remained unchanged. His voice remained steady. His leadership remained intact. But beneath that composure lingered the emotional echo of Philip's decision, not as resentment, not as weakness, but as awareness. Awareness that Philip had drawn a distinction, one he had never exploited, one that would remain forever beyond resolution. Charles carried the crown, but Edward carried something else, something quieter, something Philip had personally protected. The monarchy itself entered a new psychological era. Nothing visible had fractured, yet nothing felt entirely the same. Unity still existed, but it existed alongside uncertainty, the kind of uncertainty that comes not from conflict, but from knowledge. Knowledge that beneath the surface, invisible decisions had reshaped emotional alliances, in ways that could never be publicly addressed. The institution endured, as it always had. But endurance did not erase transformation. It only concealed it. Philip's presence, though physically gone, remained embedded within the monarchy's structure. His trust continued operating, continuing its purpose, continuing its silent reinforcement of Edward's independence. His influence extended beyond memory. It lived in the mechanisms he left behind, in the autonomy he secured, in the message he delivered without ever speaking it aloud. He had ensured that part of him would remain active, shaping events, shaping relationships, shaping the monarchy's future in ways no one could fully predict. And perhaps that was his final mastery. Philip understood something fundamental about power. Power is not always visible. It does not always wear a crown. Sometimes it exists in quiet certainty, in the ability to act without explanation, to decide without permission, and to ensure those decisions endure beyond absence. Edward now carried that certainty. Charles carried the crown, and between them existed a truth neither could escape, yet neither would ever publicly confront. The monarchy moved forward, as it always must. Ceremonies continued, appearances continued. The illusion of permanence remained intact, but beneath that permanence, Philip's decision continued to echo. Qur ayet, unavoidable, unfinished. Because legacies like his do not end with death. They evolve, they influence, they wait. Because in the monarchy, the most powerful decisions are never announced, they are discovered. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.